The Elder Scrolls 6 has a launch window, at least the earliest possible launch window, as well as an indication that it will not be coming to PlayStation. I want to look at an article from Insider Gaming to kind of get us started, but really what I want to discuss is 2026 too early, considering it's 3 years from now? How could they leverage that time frame to maybe line up with the next console to actually have this be a launch title for the next Xbox? The other thing to consider is how can they leverage a title the size of Elder Scrolls to better grow Game Pass? Starfield undoubtedly had an impact on Game Pass, but the real question is, how can you start leveraging games to make Game Pass more sticky, make it really, really hard for people to leave? I recently saw a discussion about this, and basically what he was saying was when you make a subscription service sticky, you have to have like a cadence of things that keep you in the funnel, and a really big title that does that and continually updates and add things while also being on the subservice, I think could be leveraged. I think games of this size will be the ones that can be leveraged in the best way for Xbox to grow its Game Pass user base. That is something they're heavily focused on. We know, we just reported on this. They need to see significant growth of Game Pass off of the Xbox console, and Elder Scrolls could be one of those games to help with that. I still think one of the biggest barriers is the Steam user base, getting them to go on a subservice where they don't really own the game, and they're really accustomed to having their library in Steam. But Elder Scrolls 6 could show up as early as 2026, which seems kind of crazy, right? How in the world are they going to get this thing out in 3 years? Well, I have some ideas on what they could do, and I'll reference one of the bigger titles that came out this year in 2023 as, you know, a path for them. But let's take a look at this article from Insider Gaming just to kind of get us started. Report: Elder Scrolls 6 expected 2026 or later, not on PlayStation. I don't think anybody is surprised, by the way, about the not on PlayStation thing. That is not something that I expected to see change anytime soon. It became pretty clear after the FTC hearings that even Xbox's CFO was sort of shocked when Phil Spencer was like, yeah, all of Bethesda's stuff now and in the future, it's all exclusive. Nothing's going to PlayStation. I think they expected the case-by-case basis to be a little bit more case-by-case, and it just wasn't. And so after we saw those documents, I had no expectations of Elder Scrolls hitting PlayStation. It's very clear that Microsoft has really, really circled the wagons around the Bethesda properties. So let's read on here. In an all-new documented release from the heart of the FTC versus Microsoft trial, it was reported that Elder Scrolls 6 is expected 2026 or later, and it won't be available on PlayStation platforms. This document takes the form of a matrix of games ranging from Deathloop to Fallout, and from Starfield to the Elder Scrolls 6, and it shows in black and white, in Microsoft's own words, that the Elder Scrolls 6 will skip over PlayStation. I do think this is an interesting strategy, given that we know Microsoft wants to acquire a bunch of property, and then you want to make money off that property. And they see Bethesda maybe as more of an arm for growing Game Pass, but Activision Blizzard more for just great revenue, just great footprint, but could also bolster Game Pass as well. Given how well and how good the sales were for Fallout 4 on PlayStation, Starfield definitely probably took a revenue hit, a commercial sales hit, by not being on PlayStation, and they're anticipating doing that again with what would arguably be a bigger title, you know, a more long-standing title, a more long-awaited title. Kind of like how we've never seen Half-Life 3, there's always the worry that the shadow of the previous game sort of looms too large. We know that Skyrim is sort of the monolithic RPG, open world RPG, that really changed the landscape of what we thought about big open world games, about what we thought about RPGs. And that still could be one of the challenges here, which is why I want to talk about how I actually think 2026 is a year we could see the Elder Scrolls 6. Let's keep reading here. Starfield proved, I can't click out of this, there we go. Starfield proved to be a monumental success on Xbox and PC, surpassing 6 million players in just a few days, and marking itself up as Bethesda's biggest launch ever. It was a testament to the power of marketing and of Xbox Game Pass. Since then, Starfield has remained strong, sitting at the top of the sales charts and trending like wildfire on social circles. Now, as far as being their biggest launch ever, I'm still confused as to how it's a bigger launch than Fallout 4. Fallout 4 had better numbers on Steam, seemingly had higher sales numbers. I just don't know what they're gauging that off as far as like biggest launch. What's determining that? Like if you look at the Fallout 4 Steam charts, it still hasn't been surpassed by any of the peaks with Starfield. Now, maybe they're counting early access, and that window of time is getting to kind of get lumped in. I know opening weekend at the box office is harder and harder to gauge because some of those movies were coming out earlier, and it was hard to be like, oh, you know, how much money did they really generate on opening weekend? There's also ticket prices going up. We've seen that, right? If you're going to claim, oh, this was the biggest movie of the year or biggest movie of the decade, sometimes it can get a little silly because we're just sort of moving the goalposts just right to make the claim. So I'm still not sure how they're making that claim. I don't know if that's been like really spelled out as to what they mean, but Starfield was really big, and Elder Scrolls, I think, would likely be bigger in my estimation, at least. And there's this chart here that they're showing. It seems that the Elder Scrolls 6 will follow the same path, and according to a recent document released by the FTC and Microsoft Trial, Bethesda Game Studios has no plans to release the game on PlayStation platforms. So you can see all the way over here with the red X's, it is an existing IP, yes. Multiplayer, no. Cross-platform, no. Released on PlayStation, no. So you can see right here, these are all games that previously came out. So they all have that nice green check mark. But as soon as Starfield and Redfall show up, from then on out, it's a no-go. And again, I didn't find this very surprising after the FTC hearing. This sort of lines up with what we're hearing. So I want to talk about the 2026 date, though, because I think that's more interesting. It's like, oh, it won't be on PlayStation. Okay, we kind of all expected that. Let's talk about 2026. So from my estimation, I actually think this would be a great time to get the game out there if they can get enough built. If you could build like a first area or a first chapter, first act, as it were, and really learn from what Baldur's Gate 3 was able to do. Because if you enter into early access in 3 years, which would be 2026, and you spend 2 or 3 years in early access, you could really leverage the community well. Like, this is essentially what Baldur's Gate 3 was able to do. And look at the size of that game. Look at the freedom. Look at the praise that it's receiving. It's basically headed toward, I believe, an easy Game of the Year win. Massive commercial success. Just undoubtedly the surprise hit of the year, but also a very big hit. And we were looking at, you know, sort of the things that went into early access and how much that benefited the game. And I initially thought, what other title could do this? And the first game I thought of was Diablo. Diablo 4, I think, very much could have benefited from entering early access a couple of years ago, and they would have learned all the lessons they're learning now. But it would have only been with like the first act of the game, right? Maybe a sample of the end game. Maybe have a specific area you would go with an endgame character so that you didn't actually go from, you know, Act 1 all the way to the endgame. They would sort of give you two experiences to try out and provide that feedback. Because I think you can get away with that when you have a very big and established franchise. So that was the first game I thought. I was like, man, Diablo 4 really could have taken the Baldur's Gate 3 approach. I don't think early access works for everyone. There's kind of an ocean of early access on Steam. And if you try that with your title, man, you got to get really lucky, or you really got to nail it if you're going to stand out. But when you're Diablo, or when you're the Elder Scrolls 6, there would be immediate response and interest. And many people would say, but am I going to have to pay money, right? You had to pay to get into Baldur's Gate 3. I had somebody ask me very pointedly, they're like, would you have paid $60 to play Diablo 4 early? And I was like, yeah. Like, it's Diablo. If I know what I'm getting into, if there's sort of this disclaimer that, hey, this is early access to help us build the real game, I would have fully supported that. Even if I didn't take part in forum discussions or, you know, bug reports, just my behavior in the game is a valid and valuable data point when playing a game in early access. Now, obviously, I would have made videos as well, and that goes out into sort of the ether and the conversation and the overarching community feedback. So I would be willing to pay for early access to Elder Scrolls, and I know people groan at the idea. They're like, oh, that's terrible. Why would we do that? We are entering, in my estimation, we are entering into an era of gaming where games are getting too big for what is called waterfall development. And if you're familiar with the term waterfall development, what it means is you do everything, and then like a waterfall, you just dump the game out onto the public, or you give the product or the application to the customer. When I worked for a small tech company, he was very much against waterfall development, Because what ends up happening is you spend all this time building it and building it and building it, and then you're like, here's your application that you wanted, and they're like, yeah, this isn't really what we wanted, and we've changed our mind, and we actually don't want that anymore, and this feature over here isn't exactly how we originally envisioned it. My boss at the time was a huge proponent of agile development, which is you do smaller iterations and tweak along the way so that when you're done with the project, it's exactly what the customer wants. And I believe that some games are simply too large for waterfall development. You have to put so much time and so much energy into it that once the game's out there in the wild, if all of a sudden the community breaks one way or feels a certain way about something, there's nothing you can do. Like, that's it. It's baked into the game. If you make decisions about your skills, your game flow, your content loop, your progression speeds, your onboarding, if it doesn't vibe with the audience when the game launches, you're in trouble because it's going to spit people right back out the other side, and your big, massive game is just sort of sitting there dangling off a cliff, and no one's there to pull it up and help it be successful. You kind of lose your audience before you even get started. I think live service games especially are going to have to consider something like this. You need some way of putting the game out there, filling the funnel in an agile way so that it's a smaller, more moldable, more malleable version of the game instead of like, here's everything, boom, and you're like, well, this isn't good enough. Whether you're Anthem or when Destiny 1 originally launched, I would even say Diablo 4, and I would even say Starfield. Like, these are games I think that could have really benefited from consumer feedback in an early access environment where your game is in a more moldable state. And that's what I'm thinking about Elder Scrolls 6. It's like, you know what? You could land in 2026, and you could spend 2 to 3 years getting player feedback about progression, size, customization, questing, the sense of freedom, the sense of scope, the sense of size. I don't think we're in an era anymore where you can just go big and that's all that matters. Because the larger your game gets, the more challenging it becomes to onboard the player and then keep the player. I've been running into this specifically when thinking through the lengthy onboarding of Cyberpunk Vanilla, the original game. Right now, if you start out, it's a super long opener, very slow. Same could be said for Starfield. I did a show about this, right? You probably came from that show. So those two games kind of have that reality. And as I've thought about it, it's like there's so much in the game. There's so many systems. There's so many things that they want to acclimate you to. It's almost necessary for them to do that. I think there's going to need to be some innovation, some creativity brought to player onboarding and sort of tutorial-esque content, what that looks like in a game the size of Starfield, the size of Elder Scrolls 6, because if you don't do it right, nobody wants to say, well, you just got to push through hour 10, hour 20. Well, that's when things really get good. And I know a lot of people push back and they say, but these are games where you're supposed to play that long. This is true. That doesn't mean the first 10 hours need to be paced slowly or be boring. You're teaching the player not just how to play the game, but you're teaching the player what your game's about. And if your opener and your onboarding is not representative of the larger product, I believe you've made a fatal error. And when I look at a game, the potential scope and size of Elder Scrolls 6, early access would be a really, really great way to fine-tune the player onboarding. Get it just right. Even recently, I played a rogue in early access in the Epic Game Store called Witchfire, and it's really rough. It's not approachable at all. But if you can get over the very unwelcoming hump right at the beginning, it is super fun. Well, that's feedback in early access that they're taking in, they're going to consider. Like, maybe we can smooth some of the rough edges. Maybe we could lower some of these earlier damage or skill or difficulty hurdles so people can kind of get a taste for the content loop before we start kicking them back out and killing them, right? So I think that's why I think, and I'm going to be a big advocate for more early access, specifically in games the size of Elder Scrolls, when you have a recognizable and very, very well-known franchise and a game that wants to be this big, man, you could leverage early access to just really, really great effect. The last thing I want to say is this could set up the game to be a great launch title for whatever next-gen console, whatever hardware, whatever new ethos or era we're entering into in, 2028 or 2029. I'm not sure what the exact hardware timeline is for Xbox, but it'd be a nice ramp up to have an amazingly well-built, polished Elder Scrolls by that time. Now, that leaves me with questions about the engine, right? The creation engine is super, super moddable, and we know the modding community loves it. We know they love it. Bethesda loves it because the modders can come in and make everything look nicer. They seemingly don't care about that. There's already mods that make the characters look significantly better from people that don't even work at the company, and for Starfield specifically. And we know they love the engine for that reason. We know that's also sort of a lot of years of institutional knowledge. This is a very familiar engine. They've got the tools, they've got the know-how, they've got the experience. So I don't know if they would be willing to leave it behind, but there just does seem to be a very dated, a very constrained feeling. The item, the perpetual item thing, item permanence that is. I just think some of these things are really going to hold back the game. If a game comes out if Elder Scrolls 6 comes out, 2028 or whenever it comes out, and we're looking at another game similar to the graphical fidelity of Starfield, if we're looking at another game similar to sort of the loading screen abundance of Starfield, I just don't think that would go over very well. I think even Starfield is getting chopped down a couple pegs because of that. It just doesn't look like a next-gen game. It doesn't look like a game that's ushering us into this new era that we were supposed to be in with high-fidelity graphics and no more loading screens and 60 FPS and ray tracing. Like, just none of those things are present in that game, and I don't think Elder Scrolls 6 would get away with that. I don't even know if Starfield's really getting away with that. I think that did turn a lot of players off. It didn't feel like or look like a next-gen game. And that, I think, is in part because of the engine. I think there's other things at play that happen with Starfield, but I do think the engine is part of the equation. Lastly, you could really leverage this for Game Pass, right? If everybody's getting in early access for free on Steam or on Xbox, or maybe they're paying like they did with Baldur's Gate 3, well, you could let Game Pass users in for free, maybe even give them some bonuses, like, hey, all Game Pass users get, a monthly in-game quest or item or something just as a thank you. They've got to start to think through, how do you keep people on Game Pass month to month, and early access in a game of this size could be a perfect time to sort of do some testing of, hey, if you're on Game Pass, you get some cool stuff in the game every month. And I think we're going to start to see stuff like that implemented, because that's the only real way I could see making Game Pass feel like an ongoing subscription and not just something that you sign up for once. You can try out a game and then cancel. Because if you wait and you're like, oh, here comes a big title, let me get Game Pass, and then you cancel it a month later, that's not ideal for Game Pass's consumer growth, for Xbox's growth of the subscription funnel. They've got to figure out a way to get people in and then keep them there so that you can start to see the growth getting beyond where they seem to have plateaued with about 25 million subscribers. So those are my thoughts on Elder Scrolls 6. And not surprisingly, it's not on PlayStation. The launch window might be a reality if they consider doing early access, because they have, I believe, the recipe for early access. A big, well-known title that is attempting to be a very big and large in scope project. Baldur's Gate 3, I think, taught us some good lessons. And then, lastly, just how they could maybe leverage a new engine. Maybe they could leave, Creation Engine behind. Probably not. Too many people at the company that are familiar with that engine. But then also, they could leverage Elder Scrolls 6 for Game Pass. Now, these videos typically roll over into a members-only debrief. Become a member for $5 a month. It supports me directly. And then you get into the extra behind-the-scenes content. You can even choose Member Plus. That's $6 instead of $5, and you get into the writer's room where we plan our uploads, we plan our shows, and you get to be a part of that. As always, if I don't see you in the members content, make sure you hit subscribe and the bell button so I can see you in the next video.